A November night in Chicago cut like a blade, merciless and raw, when Abraham Callahan heard gunshots for the first time. He'd just come from a tense meeting with the lieutenants in his organization, driving alone along a deserted stretch of suburban road, hoping this rare pocket of quiet might help him forget the face of the traitor he'd dealt with that afternoon. But silence could wait. The gunfire cracked out 3 times in quick succession. Then came a woman's scream, then a child's crying, the sound of lives staring straight at death. Abraham was 37, the Mafia boss who controlled all of South Chicago. He'd built this empire from ashes after watching his father betrayed and killed when he was 15. His little sister, Molly, only 8, had died that same night. For 22 years, he'd tried to bury that memory under power and blood. But some things can't be buried, and some sounds can't be ignored. He stopped the car, drew his gun, and walked toward the dark alley. He found them under a dying streetlight, where old brick walls formed a dead end with no way out. A thin, worn woman lay over a little girl, using her own body as a shield. 3 men stood around them. One of them had his gun raised, steadying his aim, ready to fire the last shot. The woman wasn't crying or begging. She lay there with one arm locked tight around her daughter, and in the other hand a blood-slick switchblade. She'd managed to stab one of them, and he was bleeding from the stomach. Blood was running from her left shoulder, too, where the first bullet had punched through. Yet she didn't let go of the child. She stared straight into the barrel with the eyes of someone who'd already accepted death, asking only to die first, so she wouldn't have to watch her daughter be killed. The little girl, maybe 5, didn't sob out loud. She lay motionless beneath her mother, eyes wide and hollow, as if she'd seen violence so often she no longer knew how to be afraid. That silence made Abraham's spine go cold more than any scream ever could. Abraham didn't hesitate. He fired 3 times. 3 bodies hit the wet concrete. The shot slammed back and forth between the alley walls, and in the heavy, thick silence that followed, the woman slowly lifted her head, her arms still wrapped tight around her daughter. She looked at Abraham with wary green eyes, not with the gratitude of someone who'd been saved, but with the hard calculation of a feral creature deciding whether this new arrival was more dangerous or less dangerous than the men now lying dead. She was waiting for the 4th bullet. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like to support the channel. Share the video with anyone who needs to hear about redemption and compassion. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Abraham walked closer to the 3 bodies, his eyes sweeping quickly over each face. He didn't recognize any of them, but the tattoo on the wrist of the nearest one made him stop. A snake coiled around a sword, the symbol of the Mancini crew. He'd seen that mark on the dead of many enemies over the past 22 years. Salvatore Mancini's men, the same man who'd given the order to kill his father, to kill his sister. He lifted his gaze to the woman still lying over her little girl, blood from her shoulder soaking through the thin patch of her coat. She didn't run. She didn't thank him. She didn't beg. She just stayed there, switchblade still in her hand, eyes locked on him as if she were waiting for him to raise his gun again. "Who are you?" Abraham asked, his voice flat, without emotion. "Why does Mancini's crew want you dead?" The woman stayed silent for a long time. Then she slowly sat up, pulling the child into her arms, her face tightening with pain but not a single sound slipping out. The little girl still didn't cry, didn't speak, only clung to her mother with tiny hands that trembled. "Willa Brennan," the woman finally said, her voice rough and hoarse. "Derek Brennan's wife." Abraham felt the muscles in his face go rigid. Derek Brennan, Salvatore Mancini's right hand, the sworn enemy of the Callahan family. He was standing in front of the wife of one of the men he wanted to kill more than anyone in this world. Derek Brennan's wife. He repeated slowly, running from her own husband, with Mancini's men chasing her. "Why?" Willa looked at him, her green eyes catching what little light the dying street lamp still gave. She was weighing him, deciding whether she could trust him or not. At last she spoke, so low it was almost a whisper. "I have something Derek wants back, something that could put him in prison for the rest of his life." "What is it?" "Evidence." She didn't say anything more. She didn't explain evidence of what, where it was, how she got it. She'd revealed enough for him to understand the shape of the situation, but not enough for him to use it against her. Smart. Abraham studied her for a long moment, then looked down at the child in her arms. The girl was about 5, brown curls matted with sweat and dirt, eyes with the same piercing gaze as her mother's but hollow in a way that was hard to look at. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She didn't do any of the things a normal child would do after watching 3 men get shot dead in front of her. She just sat there, clinging to her mother, staring into nothing with the eyes of someone who'd seen far too much. Something tightened around Abraham's chest. Those eyes. He'd seen those eyes before. In the mirror. Every day for 22 years. And on Molly's face, his little sister's. In the last seconds before the bullet stole her life. "What's her name?" he asked, his voice suddenly gone rough. Willa pulled her daughter closer, protection surging in her instinctively. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I need to know the name of the child I'm about to save." Willa stared at him, not understanding, or not daring to believe. "Poppy," she said after a long silence. "Her name is Poppy. Poppy." Abraham looked at the little girl, at those empty eyes, at the way she clung to her mother as if that were the only thing left in the world. 5 years old. Molly had been 8 when she died, only 3 years older than this child. He hadn't saved Molly. He'd stood there at 15, helpless, watching his sister fall into a pool of blood. He'd lived with that memory for 22 years. 22 years trying to bury it under power, money, and the blood of his enemies. But some things can't be buried. "Get in the car," Abraham said, a voice that didn't allow argument. "I'll take you somewhere safe." Willa didn't move. "I don't know who you are. I've got no reason to trust you. I'm Abraham Callahan." He saw her eyes widen. She knew that name. Of course she did. Derek Brennan's wife couldn't not know the name of her husband's greatest enemy. "Callahan," she whispered, her voice threaded with fear, and something else. Maybe hope. "You're Mancini's enemy, and that means I'm your husband's enemy too." He looked straight into her eyes. "You can stay here and wait for Mancini's crew to send more men. Or you can get into my car and let me take you somewhere no one will ever find. The choice is yours." Willa looked at him, looked at the 3 bodies on the ground, looked at her daughter in her arms. Then she stood, unsteady from blood loss but determined not to fall. She held Poppy with her right arm, her left hand still gripping the switchblade. She didn't trust him. It showed in every careful step, in the way she kept her distance, in the way she never let him behind her. But she had no other choice, and she knew it. Abraham opened the car door and waited for her to get in. When she sat down, he saw Poppy look up, and for the first time there was something in the child's eyes other than emptiness, not hope, not gratitude, curiosity, as if she were wondering why this man had saved them instead of killing them, the way all the other men in her short life had tried to do. Abraham didn't have an answer for the child. He didn't have an answer for himself either. He only knew he couldn't walk away. Not tonight. Not when those eyes looked at him like that. He shut the door, walked around to the driver's seat, and turned the engine over. In the rearview mirror, he saw Willa still holding the knife, her eyes still sharp and watchful on the back of his neck. Good, he thought. Never trust anyone. Not even me. The car surged into the darkness, leaving 3 cold bodies behind in a nameless alley. Abraham's estate sat deep in the southern suburbs of Chicago, hidden behind rows of ancient oak trees and a stone wall 10 feet high. When the car stopped at the iron gate, Willa looked through the window and felt her heart tighten. This wasn't a shelter. This was a fortress. Security cameras were mounted everywhere. Guards stood in the shadows, and the warm yellow light spilling from the tall windows made the house look like a creature with its eyes open, waiting for prey. She held Poppy closer, her fingers still gripping the handle of the switchblade inside her coat pocket, from a tiger's jaws into a wolf's den. Abraham brought them in through a back entrance, avoiding the curious looks of the guards. He made a phone call in a clipped voice, ordering someone to come immediately. Less than 20 minutes later, a white-haired man walked in carrying a black leather bag. "Dr. Mercer," Abraham said by way of introduction, offering no further explanation. Mercer looked at Willa with the eyes of someone who'd treated too many wounds to be surprised anymore. He didn't ask where she'd been shot, why, or by whom. He simply told her to sit down, cut her shirt open, and went to work with steady, professional hands. The bullet had gone through her left shoulder, missing bone, missing an artery. Lucky. Or maybe fate wasn't ready to let her die. Willa bit down hard as Mercer stitched the wound, refusing to let a sound escape. She'd endured worse pain than this. 6 years with Derek had taught her how to turn pain into silence. The whole time, Poppy sat on the sofa a few feet away, staring at her mother without crying, without speaking. The child's silence hurt Willa more than the bullet ever could. When Mercer finished and left, an older woman stepped into the room. She was around 68, silver hair twisted into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, a face lined with wrinkles but eyes that were still bright and warm. "Pearl," Abraham said. "This is Pearl. She'll take care of a place for you and the little one." Pearl didn't offer small talk. She walked straight to Poppy, knelt down to the girl's eye level, and looked at her with an expression Willa had never seen anyone give her daughter before. Not pity, not curiosity, understanding. As if she'd seen eyes like that before, as if she knew exactly what lay behind that emptiness. "What's her name?" Pearl asked gently. "Poppy," Willa answered for her, because she knew Poppy wouldn't open her mouth. Pearl nodded, not pushing the child to speak. She only held out her hand, palm up, and waited. Poppy stared at that hand for a long time. Then, very slowly, she placed her own hand into Pearl's. Willa felt something tighten in her throat. It was the first time Poppy had reached for a stranger since they'd started running. Pearl led them upstairs to a large room with a double bed, an oak wardrobe, and a window looking out over the back garden. "There's a lock on the inside," Pearl said, as if reading Willa's mind. "You can lock the door if you want. No one can come in unless you allow it." Willa looked at her, unsure whether to thank her or to be even more on guard. This woman knew too well what a hunted woman needed. That meant she'd seen cases like Willa's before, or she'd been one of them. When Pearl left, Willa closed the door and turned the lock. She set Poppy on the bed, pulled the blanket up over her, then sat beside her with her back against the headboard, eyes never leaving the door. She took the switchblade out and slid it under the pillow, within easy reach. She didn't sleep. She couldn't sleep. Downstairs, Abraham was standing in his study when the door swung open, and a younger man, only a few years behind him, strode in. Brody Callahan, his brother, with the same cold gray eyes but a far hotter temper. "You've lost your mind," Brody said the moment the door shut. "Derek Brennan's wife? You brought Derek Brennan's wife into this house." Abraham didn't turn around. He stood at the window, staring out into the night. "She's running from him. That's her problem, not ours." Brody stepped closer. "Do you know where this leads? Mancini will find out. Derek will find out. We'll have a war over a woman you don't even know." Abraham turned, his gaze cold as steel. "She has a 5-year-old daughter, Brody. The same age Molly was when she died." Brody went silent. That name always had the power to strip words away. Abraham and Brody never spoke about Molly, never mentioned that night, but the ghost of an 8-year-old girl was always there between them, in every decision, every movement. Brody's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and Abraham caught something flicker across his brother's face. Not worry, not fear. Something else. Something Abraham couldn't read. "I have to take this," Brody said, and stepped out before Abraham could ask. The door closed. Abraham watched him go, his brow tightening. Brody was hiding something. He knew his brother well enough to see it, but he didn't ask. Not yet. He had more urgent problems to solve. At 3 a.m, a scream tore through the quiet night. Abraham sprang up from his chair in the study, his hand going for his gun on instinct. Then he realized the sound was coming from upstairs. A child. He stopped at the foot of the staircase, listening to Willa trying to soothe her daughter, her voice shaking with exhaustion and despair. "Shh, Poppy, shh. Mommy's here. Mommy's here. No one's going to hurt you. No one's going to hurt you." But the crying didn't stop. It kept coming, wave after wave, as if the little girl were finally trying to pour out everything she'd been forced to hold in for so long. Abraham stood there in the darkness, listening. He didn't go up. He didn't know what he would do if he did. He just stood there, gripping the stair rail so hard his knuckles ached, and felt his heart, the thing he'd believed had died 22 years ago, stabbing awake again with every painful beat. The next morning, Brody placed a thick file on Abraham's desk. He'd been up all night digging for every scrap of information he could find on Willa Brennan, and what he'd uncovered had dragged his face into a darker, heavier set. Abraham looked at his brother and knew at once something was wrong. Brody wasn't a man who startled easily. He'd seen enough horror in this world to grow callous to it, but this morning there was something in Brody's eyes Abraham couldn't name. Maybe worry, maybe fear, or maybe pity, directed at his own brother. "Read it," Brody said, his voice low and weighted. "You need to know." Abraham opened the file. The first page was Willa's portrait photo, taken from a marriage registration record 6 years earlier. She was much younger then, her green eyes still carrying light, not yet beaten down by years of living in hell. Abraham turned to the next page. Family background. Willa's parents had died when she was little. A car accident. Nothing remarkable. She'd been raised by her older sister, who became her parent in all but name from the time Willa was 12. Her sister's name was Noelle. Noelle Garner. Abraham stopped. He read the name again, then again. Something familiar was knocking at the door of his memory, but he couldn't catch it yet. He turned the page, and his heart stopped. Noelle Garner, 23, died in a warehouse fire at warehouse number 7 on Eastwood Street, in the industrial district on the east side of Chicago. Dying with her was her son, Timothy Garner, 3 years old. Cause, an electrical fire. No suspect. The incident had happened 10 years ago. Abraham felt the room tilt. He knew that warehouse. He knew that fire. He knew because he was the one who'd ordered it burned. 10 years earlier, Abraham had been in the middle of expanding territory, fighting for every inch against Mancini. Warehouse number 7 was believed to be where Mancini stored weapons. He'd received information from an inside source saying the place was empty, only merchandise, no people. He gave the order to burn it. His men set the fire at midnight. The flames consumed the entire building within 2 hours. 2 days later, he learned there had been people inside, a woman and a child. The police ruled it an accident. Faulty wiring, no one was prosecuted. Abraham had tried to bury that memory. He'd told himself it was a mistake, an accident, the cost of war. He hadn't known anyone was in there. He hadn't meant it. But none of that changed the truth that 2 lives had ended because of his command. A woman of 23, a child of 3, Willa's sister, and her nephew. Abraham shoved the file away, pushed to his feet, and walked to the window. Nausea rose in him. He could feel the wall he'd built around himself for 22 years cracking, splintering piece by piece. "Brother," Brody spoke, cautious now, like he was approaching a wounded animal. "Did you know? Back then?" Abraham didn't turn around. He braced a hand on the window frame, feeling the cold wood under his palm, trying to anchor himself to what was real. "I didn't know," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't know who was in there. I only knew people died. I didn't know names. I didn't know faces." "And now you do," Brody said. "Now you know the woman you're sheltering in this house is the little sister of the woman you killed." Abraham closed his eyes. Willa's face rose in his mind. Those wary green eyes, the way she'd thrown herself over her daughter to shield her, the way she'd held a switchblade like she was prepared to fight until her last breath. "Does she know?" he asked. "Does Willa know how her sister died?" "Not sure," Brody answered. "The police report says it was an accident. Maybe she believes that, maybe she doesn't, but she definitely doesn't know you're the one who ordered it. If she did, she wouldn't have gotten in your car." Abraham opened his eyes and stared out at the back garden. Early sunlight filtered through the leaves, laying pale streaks across the green lawn. Somewhere deeper in the house, he could hear Pearl talking to Poppy, her voice warm and gentle. Life was still moving, the sun was still rising, but Abraham felt as if he were standing at the edge of hell. "What are you going to do?" Brody asked. "Are you going to tell her?" Silence. "Brother," Brody pressed. "She has a right to know." Abraham turned and faced him. His gray eyes were ice cold, but deep inside them something was burning. Not anger, pain, guilt chewing from within. "No," he said, his voice firm as a nail driven into wood. "I won't tell her. Never. Not ever, if I can avoid it." Brody looked at his brother, silent for a long moment. Then he nodded, not because he agreed, but because he understood. Understood that Abraham was carrying a weight no one could help him set down. Understood that from now on, every time he looked at Willa, every time he looked at Poppy, he would see the ghosts of Noelle and Timothy. He would see the fire he'd lit. He would see a guilt he could never repay. "You're condemning yourself," Brody said softly. "You know that, don't you?" Abraham didn't answer. He walked back to the desk, picked up the file, and locked it into the lowest drawer of the steel cabinet. The key he slipped into the inside pocket of his coat. "No one can know this," he said without looking at Brody. "Not Pearl. No one. Do you understand?" "I understand," Brody said. "But brother, The truth has its own way of getting out. You can't hide it forever. Abraham knew his brother was right. The truth was like water. It would find a crack to slip through, no matter how many walls you built to hold it back. But he didn't need to hide it forever. He only needed to hide it long enough for Willa and Poppy to be safe, long enough for him to pay a debt he could never fully repay, long enough for him to look into the eyes of that 5-year-old child without seeing the 3-year-old who died in a sea of fire because of his order. He knew it was impossible, but he was going to try anyway, because it was all he had left to do. 2 weeks passed inside Abraham Callahan's estate, and Willa still didn't sleep through a single night. Every evening, she lay on the bed with the switchblade under her pillow, eyes wide open on the ceiling, listening for the smallest sound drifting down the hallway. During the day, she watched. She watched everything. She counted how many guards patrolled the grounds, memorized their shift changes, marked each face so she'd know who was new and who had been here for years. She learned the layout of the house, mapping in her mind the location of every door, every window, every possible exit she could use if things turned. She watched Abraham. He was the biggest unknown she had to solve. A mafia boss saving 2 strangers, bringing them home, feeding them, housing them, asking for nothing. It didn't make sense. In the world Willa had lived in for the last 6 years, no one did anything without an agenda. Derek had taught her that lesson in blood and tears. She needed to know what Abraham wanted. She needed to find his weakness. Because once you know someone's weakness, you know how to protect yourself. One evening, after Poppy had fallen asleep and Pearl had retreated to her room, Willa went downstairs. She found Abraham in his study, sitting alone at his desk, a glass of whiskey in front of him already half gone. He didn't look up when she stepped in, but she knew he'd registered her presence. She could feel the alertness in the air, even though Abraham didn't act surprised. "How many people have you killed?" Willa asked bluntly, with no detour. Abraham was silent for a moment. Then he lifted his head and looked at her with eyes the color of cold steel, but without anger in them. "More than I can remember," he answered, as calmly as if he were talking about the weather. "Why are you asking?" Willa didn't flinch. She moved deeper into the room and stopped across from him, the oak desk between them. "I need to know what kind of man I'm living with. Are you a monster?" "I'm what life made me," Abraham said. "I don't justify what I've done. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not pretending I'm a good man. But I keep my word. When I say I'll protect you and your daughter, I'll do it. Whether you believe me or not is your choice." Willa studied him, searching for deception in his eyes. She'd lived with Derek long enough to learn how to spot when a man was lying. Derek lied like breathing, and she'd spent the first 3 years before she finally saw it for what it was. But Abraham wasn't like Derek. He wasn't trying to seem kind. He wasn't trying to charm her or talk her into anything. He was simply telling a raw truth and letting her decide what to do with it. That unsettled her more than Derek's cruelty ever had. "Why did you save us?" she asked. Abraham didn't answer right away. He looked down at his whiskey, slowly turning the glass in his hand, the warm light catching the surface of the amber liquid. "Because once I didn't save someone," he said at last, "and I'll live with that for the rest of my life." Willa wanted to ask more. She wanted to know who he meant, but something in his voice stopped her. An old wound she had no right to touch. At least not yet. She turned and left the room without another word. In the days that followed, Poppy became Willa's greatest worry. The child refused to eat. Pearl made porridge, soup, baked bread. But Poppy only stared at the food with those empty eyes and shook her head. Willa had to beg, had to coax for hours, just to get her to swallow a few spoonfuls. Nights were worse. Poppy wet the bed nearly every night, waking in panic with sheets soaked through and eyes full of terror. Willa would change the linens, change her clothes, hold her close, and sing softly until the little girl fell asleep again. Then Willa would lie there, not sleeping, waiting for the next nightmare to come. Poppy clung to her mother with a desperate intensity. She wouldn't let Willa leave her sight for more than 5 minutes. If Willa went to the bathroom, Poppy waited outside the door. If Willa went down to the kitchen for water, Poppy followed close behind. The child didn't speak to anyone but her mother, and even with her mother, she rarely opened her mouth. Willa was exhausted, body and mind. The wound in her shoulder was healing, but there were other wounds no one could see, no medicine could touch. One night, around 2 a.m, there was a soft knock at the door. Willa startled, her hand reaching for the knife, and then she heard Pearl's voice through the wood. Is she asleep yet? I brought some porridge up. Willa opened the door. Pearl stood there holding a steaming bowl, her face gentle and calm. But when she looked at Willa, her eyes paused. Willa knew how she must look. Eyes red and swollen, cheeks wet, arms still wrapped tight around Poppy asleep against her. She'd been crying for the last hour, crying without sound because she was afraid of waking her daughter, crying until there were no tears left to cry. Pearl didn't say anything. She simply stepped inside, set the bowl on the bedside table, then gently pulled the blanket up over mother and child. Her hand was warm when it touched Willa's shoulder, a simple gesture that carried more understanding than words ever could. Then she stood there, looking down at Willa and Poppy, and Willa saw something in her eyes. Not pity, not curiosity. The recognition of someone who'd once been in the exact same place, who'd held a child and wept in the dark, who'd tried to stay strong while the world collapsed. "You used to be like me," Willa whispered. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. Pearl didn't answer. She only gave a faint smile, the sad smile of someone who'd lived through too much grief, then turned away and closed the door behind her. Willa looked at the steaming bowl, then down at Poppy asleep in her arms. For the first time since she'd stepped into this house, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone. On the 14th night, Poppy's screaming tore through the stillness of the dark. But this time, Willa couldn't get up. Her body had gone past its limit after nearly 2 weeks of almost no sleep. She heard her daughter crying, heard her screaming for her mother, but she couldn't force her eyes open, couldn't move her arms or legs. She tried with everything she had, but her body betrayed her. It dragged her down into the heavy sleep of exhaustion, leaving her daughter's cries to echo in the darkness. Abraham was sitting in his study when the screams carried down. He was used to that sound, had heard it every night for 2 weeks. But tonight, there was something different. The crying went on longer than usual. There was no Willa murmuring comfort, no familiar lullaby, just Poppy's screams, alone, in the dark. He waited 5 minutes, 10. The crying didn't stop. He stood, left the study, and went up the stairs to the 2nd floor. The door to Willa and Poppy's room was slightly open. He pushed it gently, and what he saw tightened his heart. Willa lay motionless on the bed, eyes shut, her chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of exhausted sleep, and Poppy sat curled in the corner of the bed, hugging a pillow, her face soaked with tears, her mouth still crying even though her voice had gone hoarse. The child saw Abraham in the doorway and cried louder, but not from fear, from despair, from loneliness, because her mother wasn't waking up and she didn't know what to do. Abraham stepped inside, feeling like an intruder. He didn't know what to do with children. He hadn't been close to a child since Molly died. For 22 years, he'd kept his distance from anything that reminded him of his little sister. But now this 5-year-old was looking at him with tear-filled eyes, and he couldn't turn away. He moved closer to the bed, slowly, one step at a time, as if approaching a wounded wild animal. Poppy didn't run. She didn't scream in terror. She just sat there and watched him, tears still falling, but her crying began to fade. Abraham sat down beside the bed, keeping space between them, not touching her. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to do. He only sat there in the dark, listening to the child's ragged breathing and feeling more helpless than he ever had. Then, without understanding why, he began to speak. "I had a little sister," he said, his voice deep and low. "Her name was Molly. She had brown hair, like you, and blue eyes, like yours too." Poppy stopped crying and looked at him with wet lashes. She didn't say anything, but she was listening. Abraham went on, his voice even, as if telling a sad bedtime story. "Molly loved strawberry ice cream. She could eat a whole bucket and never get tired of it. And she was afraid of the dark. Every night, I had to sit by her bed until she fell asleep, because she said there was a monster under her bed." He paused, eyes fixed on nothing, as if he could see Molly standing there. "One night, bad people came to our house. They hurt my father, and they hurt Molly too. I couldn't save her. I stood there and watched her fall, and I couldn't do a thing." His voice trembled slightly, but he didn't stop. "Since that night, I haven't been afraid of the dark anymore. Because I learned the real monsters aren't under the bed. The real monsters are grown-ups who hurt children, and I swore I'd never let any child be hurt if I could stop it." Poppy watched him, her clear blue eyes no longer spilling tears. She didn't speak, but she was listening. Truly listening. For the first time since she'd come here, someone was talking to her, not to hush her, not to make her eat or sleep, but simply to share a story. A sad story. A story about loss. A story that a 5-year-old, in her own way, could understand. "You're sad too," Poppy whispered, the first words she'd spoken since arriving in this house. Abraham looked at her, startled. He hadn't expected her to speak. He hadn't expected her voice to be that clear, hoarse from crying but still bright, like a small bell. "Yeah," he answered, his voice softening without him meaning it to. "I'm sad too." Poppy didn't say anything else. She only looked at him, with eyes that weren't empty anymore. Something was lighting up in them. Not joy, not trust. Connection. An invisible thread between two strangers carrying the same kind of wound. Outside the room, Willa was awake. She didn't know when she'd come to, but she'd heard enough. She stood in the hallway darkness, peering through the crack of the half-open door, seeing Abraham sitting beside her daughter, seeing Poppy looking at him with an expression Willa had never once seen her give anyone. She wanted to go in, wanted to take her child back, wanted to shove this stranger out of their lives. But she didn't. She only stood there, silent, watching the ruthless Mafia boss telling the story of his dead little sister to her wounded 5-year-old daughter. And for the first time, she wondered if she'd been wrong not to trust him. Poppy slowly lay down, eyes still on Abraham, lids beginning to droop. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't shaking. She simply lay there, calm, as if the presence of this stranger had chased the ghosts from her mind. Abraham didn't stand. He stayed sitting there, silent, until Poppy's breathing became steady and deep. Only then did he rise, slowly, gently, like he was afraid of waking her, and step out of the room. He didn't see Willa standing in the dark. Or maybe he did, and chose not to say anything. He simply passed her, went down the stairs, and disappeared into the house's shadows. Willa stood there a long time, looking at her sleeping daughter, then looking toward where Abraham had gone. She didn't know what to think. She only knew that tonight, something had changed. In her daughter, and maybe in herself too. Willa wasn't the kind of person who sat still and waited for fate to decide. She'd done that for 6 years with Derek, and it had nearly killed her. She wasn't going to make that mistake again. After the night Abraham told Poppy his story, she began watching him more closely. Not just to find a weakness anymore, but to understand who he truly was. The story about Molly had shifted something in the way she saw him, but she still needed answers to her own questions, especially about her sister's death. Noelle and Timothy had died in a fire 10 years ago, and the police had called it an accident. But Willa had never believed that. Not after she discovered Derek had been involved. Not after she found emails and messages on his computer, proof he'd known about the fire before it happened. Her sister hadn't died by accident. Her sister had been murdered, and Willa needed to know who had given the order. One afternoon, while Poppy was down for a nap and Pearl was in the kitchen, Willa slipped out of her room. She'd watched long enough to know Abraham's routine, to know he usually met with Brody at this hour in the basement, leaving the study empty for at least an hour. She stepped into his study, her heart pounding but her footsteps steady. The room was wide and dim, the scent of oak and old tobacco lingering in the air. Abraham's desk was strangely orderly, everything in its place. She started searching, opening drawers one by one, flipping through files. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, only that she needed something tied to the fire that year. After nearly half an hour, she found it. An old file, the paper yellowed with age, locked in the bottom drawer of the steel cabinet. A record of the organization's operations from 10 years back, including an entry on warehouse number 7 on Eastwood Street. Willa opened it and read every line with trembling eyes. The warehouse was burned, suspected to be a Mancini weapons cache. No casualties recorded, but there was a handwritten note at the bottom of the page. 2 victims, woman and child. Not in the plan. No one held responsible. Willa felt blood rush into her face. 2 victims. Her sister, her nephew. Not in the plan. As if human lives were nothing more than a rounding error in a calculation. She wanted to scream. To smash something. To find the man who'd written those cold words and make him pay. But the file didn't name the person who'd ordered it. No signature. No mark that told her who had stood behind the warehouse fire. She read it again and again, desperate for a clue, but there was nothing. A sound behind her made her whirl around. A man stood in the doorway, tall, scarred, staring at her with open contempt. She recognized him, one of Abraham's men who often guarded the gate. His name was Vince, and he'd never bothered to hide his disdain for her whenever they crossed paths. "What the hell are you doing in here?" Vince stepped into the room, his voice sharp with threat. "This is the boss's study. Nobody comes in without him." Willa straightened, the file still in her hand. She didn't back up. "That's what I'm asking you," Vince went on, moving closer. "What makes you think you've got the right to dig through his things, you little stray?" Heat flared in Willa's chest. Stray. She'd heard that word too many times from Derek and his friends. Every time she didn't obey. Every time she tried to resist. Stray, they'd say. As if she wasn't human. Only something men owned. But Willa wasn't the terrified woman from 6 years ago. She'd lived through hell. She'd been beaten, humiliated, imprisoned inside her own home. She'd seen death in her husband's eyes every time he lost control. And she'd still survived. A nameless guard didn't have the right to frighten her. She stepped forward and faced Vince, eyes locked on his. "I lived with a devil for 6 years, she said, her voice ice cold. "You don't qualify to scare me." Vince blinked, clearly not expecting her to hit back. He was used to women who stayed quiet, who bowed their heads, who trembled under a man's power. But Willa wasn't one of them. Not anymore. "You little bee." Vince started, but a voice cut in from the doorway. "That's enough, Vince." Abraham stood in the threshold, gray eyes fixed on his man. No one knew when he'd arrived, how long he'd been there, how much he'd heard. But his stare said everything. He'd heard. He'd seen. Vince immediately lowered his head and stepped back. "Boss, Get out." Abraham cut him off, his voice not loud, but heavy with authority. Vince hurried out without daring to look back. The door slammed shut. The room fell into silence. Abraham looked at Willa, then at the file in her hand. He wasn't angry that she'd been going through his things, or if he was, he hid it well. Instead, he looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not pity, not suspicion. Respect, as if he was truly seeing her for the first time. Not a victim, not a weak woman who needed protecting. A fighter, a survivor. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice calm. Willa hesitated for a single beat, then handed him the file. "My sister died in that fire. I need to know who gave the order." Abraham took the file, but he didn't open it. He already knew what was inside. He'd lived with that knowledge for 10 years, and now the woman standing in front of him was demanding the answer to the one question he never wanted to face. "I'll look into it," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes refusing hers. "You'll get an answer." Willa watched him, trying to read what hid behind that calm mask. She found nothing, but she could feel he was hiding something much bigger than what he was willing to say. She would find out. One way or another. 6 months earlier, Brody Callahan walked into a bar in the northern suburbs of Chicago, a place no one in his organization ever bothered with. He needed one quiet night, far from the pressure of meetings, the life and death decisions, and the shadow of his brother that never truly left him. He took a seat at the end of the bar, ordered a bourbon, and tried not to think about anything at all. Then she appeared. Gianna sat 2 stools away, long black hair falling loose over her shoulders. Warm brown eyes holding a sadness he recognized the instant he saw it. She ordered a martini, drank alone, and didn't make the slightest effort to draw anyone's attention. That, more than anything, drew Brody in. In his world, women usually had a purpose when they approached a man. Money, power, protection. But Gianna didn't approach him. She just sat there by herself, as if she was running from her own life too. He spoke first, a simple question about what she was drinking. She answered with a faint smile and a husky voice. They talked all night, about books, about music, about places they wanted to see but had never had the chance. No one asked about work. No one asked about family. It was as if there was an unspoken agreement that the night belonged only to them, not to the world outside. Brody took her back to a hotel. He stayed, and when the sun came up, he knew he'd fallen into a depth he wouldn't be able to climb out of. They met again after that, once a week, then twice. Then he started counting the days until the next time. He never asked what she did, where she lived, who her family was. And she never asked him, not until 3 months earlier. That night, Brody arrived at their meeting spot earlier than usual and saw a black car parked out front. He recognized the plates, Mancini. His heart went cold when the door opened, and Gianna stepped out, spoke a few words to the driver in Italian, then turned and saw Brody standing there, her face drained of color. "You're a Callahan," she said, her voice shaking. "And you're a Mancini," he answered, his voice colder than he meant it to be. They stood there in the empty lot, staring at each other like enemies who'd just realized they'd fallen in love with the wrong person. Gianna cried. She said she didn't know. Said she only wanted to escape her family. Escape the shadow of her controlling uncle. Escape a life she'd never chosen. Brody wanted to walk away, wanted to erase her as if he'd never met her. But he couldn't. He loved her too deeply. And she loved him too. Now, 3 months after that night, Brody parked in a deserted alley near the docks and waited for Gianna to arrive. She appeared 10 minutes later, wearing a black coat, a hood pulled low over her head, moving fast as if someone might be watching. He opened the car door for her. She slid into the passenger seat, breathing hard, brown eyes wide with fear. "Derek's losing his mind," she said the moment the door shut. "He knows his wife is hiding somewhere in the city. He's hired outsiders, killers who aren't part of any organization, to find her." Brody clenched his jaw. "Does he know she's at my brother's house?" "Not yet, but soon. Derek's following every thread he can find. He doesn't sleep, doesn't eat. He's got one goal and one goal only, to get his wife and child back." Gianna looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. "If my uncle finds out I'm seeing you, I'll die, Brody. He'll kill me for betraying the family." Brody took her hand and held it tight. "I won't let that happen." "How?" Gianna asked, her voice breaking with desperation. "You can't fight my whole family. You can't fight my uncle." "I'll find a way," Brody said, even though he didn't know what that way was. "Just trust me." Gianna looked at him, then nodded. She trusted him, even though she knew that trust could get them both killed. They stayed in the car a few more minutes, holding hands in silence, before Gianna had to leave. She kissed him lightly, then opened the door and vanished into the night. Brody drove back to the estate with his mind spinning. He needed to tell Abraham what he'd learned, but he couldn't tell him where it came from. He couldn't say he was in love with the enemy's niece. Abraham wouldn't understand. Or worse, Abraham would understand and demand he end it, and Brody knew he couldn't do that. He found Abraham in the study, sitting alone with a glass of whiskey like every other night. His brother looked up when Brody came in, gray eyes sharp as always. "Any news?" Abraham asked. Brody nodded, swallowing the guilt that was tightening around his throat. "Derek's going crazy looking for his wife. He's hired outsiders. Sooner or later, he'll figure out she's here." Abraham frowned. "Source?" "An inside man in Mancini," Brody said, his tone calm the way he'd practiced the whole drive home. "I can't give a name." Abraham studied his brother for a long moment, as if trying to read what Brody was hiding. Then he nodded, accepting it. "Fine. Increase security. No one comes or goes without my order." Brody nodded and turned away, leaving the room before Abraham could ask another question. He hated lying to his brother, but he hated the thought of losing Gianna more. And between the two, he'd chosen. 3 weeks after arriving at Abraham's estate, Willa made a decision she never thought she would make. She decided to trust him. Not completely, not blindly, but enough to share the secret she'd kept locked away since the day she ran. That night, after Poppy was fast asleep, Willa knocked on the door of Abraham's study. He opened it, showing no surprise at all to find her there, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and stood across from him with the familiar oak desk between them. "I have something Derek wants," she said, her voice low but clear. "Something he's willing to kill for to get back." Abraham sat down and gestured for her to take the chair across from him. He didn't ask, didn't push. He simply waited, letting her speak in her own time. Willa drew a small, worn teddy bear from her bag, carefully unzipping a hidden seam to pull out a small black USB drive. She set it on the desk between them. "Evidence," she said. "Illegal deals. Bribes to officials. A list of people Derek ordered killed. 12 names, 12 lives." Abraham looked at the USB drive but didn't touch it. "Where did you get it?" "Derek has a private office in the house," Willa explained. "He thought I was too stupid to know the password. Thought I was too afraid to go in. But I lived with him for 6 years. I know every habit he has, every secret he thinks he's hidden." She paused, eyes dropping to the USB. One night, when Derek was out of town, I went into his office. I copied everything. Everything I could find. I didn't know what I was looking for. I only knew I needed something to get out. Something to make him afraid. "And what did you find?" Abraham asked, his voice tighter than usual. Willa lifted her head and looked him straight in the eye. "I found proof Derek was involved in my sister's death." Abraham didn't react. Not on the outside, but deep in his chest, his heart was hammering. "Your sister?" he asked, his control flawless. Willa nodded, unaware that he already knew. "Noelle, my sister and my nephew died in a fire 10 years ago. The police said it was an accident. But on that USB, there's an email Derek sent to someone on the very day it happened. It talks about a warehouse that needed to be handled. The address matches where my sister died." She took the USB, plugged it into the laptop she'd brought, and opened the email file for Abraham to see. He read every line, and each word was a blade cutting into him. Derek wrote to someone named V, ordering warehouse number 7 on Eastwood Street to be burned. He said there were people inside who needed to be eliminated. A woman who knew too much, and her little boy. Derek knew there were people inside that warehouse, and he still ordered it burned. Abraham felt the blood in his veins go cold. For 10 years he'd tortured himself for accidentally killing 2 innocent people. He'd believed it was his mistake, his sin to carry. But now he knew the truth. Derek had done it on purpose. Derek wanted Noelle dead. Derek had used him as the tool. And Abraham had been the one to strike the match on an order he never questioned hard enough. "Who is V?" Willa asked, her voice bright with hope. "The man Derek gave the order to. If we find him, I can know exactly what happened that night." Abraham looked at her, at the green eyes searching for an answer he had but could never speak aloud. V was Vince, the soldier she'd confronted the day before. He was the one who took Derek's order and fed Abraham the lie. Told him the warehouse was empty. Told him there was no one inside. Lied so Abraham would give the order without suspicion. But in the end, Abraham was still the one who lit the fire. The command came from his mouth. The responsibility belonged to him. Even if Derek had laid the trap, even if Vince had lied, Abraham was still the man who killed Noelle and Timothy. And if Willa ever learned that, she would hate him. She would despise him. She would look at him with eyes he couldn't survive. "I'll help you find the one behind it," Abraham said, his voice steady as steel even as something inside him was breaking apart. "You'll get your answer." Willa watched him, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in his eyes. Not the familiar coldness, pain. A deep, bottomless pain she couldn't explain. "You know something," she said. Not a question, but a statement. Abraham didn't answer. He only stood, walked to the window, and turned his back to her. "I know a lot of things, Mrs. Brennan. That's how I've stayed alive this long. But I promise you, the one behind your sister's death will pay." Willa wanted to push harder, to force the truth out of him, but something in his posture, in the slight sag of his shoulders, made her stop. He was hiding something from her. She knew it, but she also knew he wouldn't speak, no matter what she asked. Not yet. She stood, took the USB, and went to the door. Before she left, she paused and looked back at him. "I trust you," she said, partly, "but if you betray me, I won't forgive you." Abraham didn't turn around. He only stood there, staring out at the night through the glass, and spoke in a low voice that sounded like a sigh. "I know." The door closed. Willa was gone, and Abraham stood alone in the dark, carrying the first lie he'd ever told her. A lie he knew, sooner or later, would destroy everything they were beginning to build. The 4th week began with a change no one expected. Poppy no longer clung to her mother like a shadow. She started leaving the bedroom on her own, small, silent footsteps, exploring the vast estate, as if she were searching for something. Willa worried at first, but Pearl reassured her this was a good sign. The child was starting to feel safe, starting to believe no one in this house would hurt her. That afternoon, Poppy wandered along the first-floor hallway, her little fingers sliding over the intricate floral patterns of the expensive wallpaper. She stopped at a door left slightly open, warm yellow light spilling out from inside. She pushed the door and stepped in, and found herself in a room full of books. A library. Shelves stretched all the way to the ceiling. Thousands of volumes lined up in neat rows, the scent of old paper and oak wood blending into a kind of fragrance Poppy had never smelled before. And in the corner of the room, beside a wide window looking out over the garden, Abraham was sitting alone. He didn't see her come in. His eyes were fixed on a small photograph in his hand, an old picture faded by time. His shoulders were slightly slumped, and on the face that was usually ice cold, there was something Poppy recognized right away. Sadness. Poppy knew what sadness looked like. She'd seen it on her mother's face every night for so long. She'd seen it in the mirror whenever she accidentally caught her own reflection. Sadness was like an invisible monster. It sat on people's shoulders and made them heavier, slower, more tired, and that monster was sitting on Abraham's shoulders. Poppy wasn't afraid. She had been afraid of him at first, afraid of his deep voice, afraid of his eyes like steel, afraid of how everyone in the house lowered their heads when he passed. But after the night he told her about Molly, she wasn't afraid anymore. He had someone he'd lost too. He was sad too. He was human, like her. She walked closer, her small feet making no sound on the thick carpet. She climbed up onto the armchair beside Abraham and sat down, her legs too short to reach the floor, swinging in the air. Abraham startled and turned, gray eyes widening when he saw her sitting right there beside him. He quickly slipped the photograph into his coat pocket, as if afraid someone might see his moment of weakness. But Poppy had already seen. She'd seen the sadness in his eyes. She'd seen the way he looked at that picture like it was the most precious thing in the world. She didn't say anything. She only pulled a piece of paper folded into quarters from her pocket and pushed it toward him. Abraham looked at the paper, then at her, confused. Poppy nodded, signaling for him to open it. He took the paper, unfolded it, and his heart missed a beat. A clumsy crayon drawing. 2 figures, one big and one small, standing side by side. The bigger one had black hair, like him. The smaller one had brown curly hair, like Poppy. They were holding hands. "You're sad," Poppy said, her voice clear as a bell. Poppy saw. "You looked at the picture and you were sad." Abraham didn't know what to say. He just sat there, the drawing in his hand, looking at the 5-year-old who was watching him with bright blue eyes and not a trace of fear. "Poppy's sad too," she went on. "Poppy remembers. Poppy remembers when there wasn't hitting. Poppy remembers when Mommy smiled. But Mommy doesn't smile anymore. Mommy cries every night." Poppy hears. Something clenched hard around Abraham's chest. This child was only 5, but she understood too much. She'd seen too much. She carried a weight no child should ever have to carry. "Can I be sad with you?" Poppy asked, tilting her head at him. "You're sad alone." "Poppy's sad alone, but if we're sad together, maybe it won't be as sad." Abraham opened his mouth, but no sound came out. For the first time in 22 years, the most powerful mafia boss on the south side of Chicago didn't know what to say. For the first time since Molly died, someone wanted to be near him on purpose. Not out of fear, not out of need, not because they wanted something from him, simply because the little girl didn't want him to be alone. Poppy didn't wait for an answer. She turned in the chair, leaned back against the arm, her legs still swinging. She looked out the window at late afternoon light slipping through the leaves, and began to sing softly. A lullaby Willa sang to her every night, her small, innocent voice filling the quiet library. Abraham sat there, the drawing still in his hand, listening to the child sing, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something warm melting inside his chest, something he'd thought had died 22 years ago. Outside the library door, Pearl stood silently, watching through the narrow crack. She saw Poppy beside Abraham, saw the drawing in his hand, saw the way he looked at the child with eyes shining wet. Pearl smiled, the sad smile of someone who'd waited too long for this moment, then quietly turned away, leaving the two of them in that sun-filled room. The next afternoon, a police car rolled to a stop in front of the gate of Abraham Callahan's estate. There was no siren, no flashing lights, only a man with salt and pepper hair stepping out with the calm, unhurried air of someone dropping in on an old friend. Detective Frank Holloway, 52 years old, 28 years on the job, and one of the very few cops in Chicago that Abraham's money couldn't buy. He'd been watching the Callahan family for 15 years, never once having enough evidence to prosecute. But he'd never quit. Not for a day. Abraham received Holloway in the living room, not the study, and it was a deliberate choice. The study was where he handled family business. The living room was where he entertained guests. And Holloway, whether he liked it or not, was still just a guest. "Detective," Abraham said, his tone as even as if they were discussing the weather. "Coming here without a warrant, that doesn't happen often." Holloway sat in the chair across from him without waiting to be invited. He looked at Abraham with gray eyes that had seen too much crime to be easily surprised. 3 bodies in an alley on the west side, 2 weeks ago. Mancini's men. Shot dead with a 9mm handgun. "The kind you like to use." "I like to use a lot of things," Abraham replied. "Doesn't mean everything's mine." Holloway didn't smile. He pulled a photograph from his jacket pocket and set it on the table. A still from a security camera at a store near the scene. Blurry, but clear enough to make out Abraham's car parked at the mouth of the alley on the night it happened. "You were there," Holloway said. "You killed them. I don't have direct proof, but I know, and sooner or later, I'll find it." Abraham looked at the photo and neither denied nor admitted it. The man wasn't here to arrest him. If he had enough, he would have come with a search warrant. So what did he want? Holloway leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. "I want Willa Brennan." Abraham felt the muscles in his face tighten, but he didn't let anything show. "Willa Brennan. Familiar name. Who are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Callahan," Holloway cut in. "I know she's here. I know she's got a USB drive with enough evidence to put Derek Brennan in prison for the rest of his life. And I want that USB." Silence settled over the room. Abraham studied Holloway, measuring the situation. He knew. Somehow, he knew everything. Maybe from an inside source in Mancini. Maybe from surveillance. Maybe one of Abraham's guards had been bought. "What does she get in return?" Abraham asked, neither confirming nor denying Willa's presence. "Witness protection," Holloway said. "A new identity. A new life. Safety for her and her daughter. I can guarantee that if she cooperates, and if she doesn't cooperate, then she keeps running." Holloway shrugged. "Derek Brennan's going out of his mind looking for his wife. Mancini's watching you. Sooner or later, they'll find her. And when they do, what do you think happens?" Abraham didn't answer. He knew exactly what happened. He'd seen what Derek did to people who betrayed him. "I want to speak to her," Holloway said, "directly, so she can decide for herself." Abraham was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. He called for Pearl and told her to bring Willa down. 5 minutes later, Willa walked into the living room, green eyes instantly guarded when she saw the unfamiliar man. She looked at Abraham, asking the question with her gaze, and he only gave a small nod. "Mrs. Brennan," Holloway stood, his voice more polite than it had been with Abraham. "I'm Detective Frank Holloway. I'm here to offer you a deal." Willa sat, spine straight, hands clenched tight in her lap. She didn't speak. She just waited. Holloway explained everything. The USB drive, witness protection, the chance for her and Poppy to have a new life far from Derek, far from Mancini, far from all of it. "You just hand over the evidence to me," Holloway finished. "I'll handle the rest." Willa looked at him, then looked at Abraham. Abraham sat still, expression blank, not saying a single word to push her one way or the other. "What do you think?" she asked Abraham, her voice low. Abraham met her gaze, his gray eyes deep and unreadable. "This is your decision. I won't interfere. If you give it to the police, that's the right choice. If you keep it, that's your choice too. Whatever you choose, I'll protect you and Poppy until you're safe." Willa watched him, searching for a hidden hook in his words, but there wasn't one. Abraham was letting her decide, without pressure, without manipulation, something Derek had never done. "I need time to think," she told Holloway. Holloway nodded, pulled a business card from his pocket, and placed it on the table. "That's my number. When you decide, call me. But don't take too long, Mrs. Brennan. Time isn't on your side." He stood, gave Abraham a cold nod, and walked out. When the sound of the police car faded into the distance, Willa stayed seated, staring at the card on the table. She didn't know what to do. Giving the USB to the police was the right thing. It was the way to make Derek pay. It was the way to keep her and Poppy safe. But it would also mean betraying Abraham, the man who'd saved her, the man who'd given her shelter, the man who'd told her daughter stories to sleep at night. In the corner of the room, Brody stood silently watching. The phone in his pocket buzzed. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his face went pale. A message from Gianna. "My uncle sent someone to watch your house. Be careful." Brody swallowed hard and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He looked at Abraham, looked at Willa, and felt the walls beginning to close in around them. Mancini was coming, and they didn't have much time left. That night, Willa couldn't sleep. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning around the decision Detective Holloway had placed in front of her. His business card sat on the nightstand like a constant reminder of the choice she had to make. Hand the USB to the police, get protection, get a new life. But it would also mean leaving this place, leaving Abraham, leaving the man who'd given her and her daughter shelter when no one else had. Around 2 a.m, Willa gave up trying. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Poppy sleeping soundly beside her, and eased out of the room. She went down to the kitchen, hoping a hot cup of tea might steady her. But when she stepped inside, she found Pearl already there. Pearl sat at the table with a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, eyes fixed on nothing as if she were lost in some faraway memory. When she heard Willa's footsteps, she looked up, not surprised at all. "Can't sleep either?" Pearl asked softly. Willa shook her head and sat down across from her. Pearl nudged the teapot toward her, a quiet gesture telling her to pour for herself. They sat in silence for a long time, with only the tick of the clock on the wall and the hush of wind outside the window. "You're thinking about the detective's offer," Pearl said at last. It wasn't a question. Willa nodded, not bothering to hide it. "I don't know what to do." Pearl looked at her, old eyes still bright, still knowing. She was quiet for a moment, as if deciding whether she should say anything at all. Then she sighed, set her cup down, and began to speak. "I've worked for the Callahan family since Abraham was a child," she said. "I watched that boy grow up. I saw him laugh, saw him cry, saw him love his little sister like Molly was his whole world." Willa listened without interrupting. "Molly was a sweet child," Pearl went on, her voice drifting. "Brown hair, blue eyes, always smiling. She followed Abraham like a little shadow, and Abraham never once minded. That boy loved his sister more than his own life." Pearl paused, eyes dropping to the cold tea. Then one night, everything changed. Enemies of Abraham's father came to the house. They killed him right in front of his children. And Molly, an 8-year-old who should never have had to see that, was shot when she tried to run. Willa felt her chest tighten. She'd heard Abraham mention Molly in pieces, but hearing Pearl tell it with that grief in her voice made it real in a way that hurt. "Abraham was 15, Pearl said. He stood there helpless, watching his sister go down. He held Molly in his arms in a pool of blood until the police arrived, and he wouldn't let her go. And after that night, he wasn't a child anymore." Pearl lifted her gaze and looked straight into Willa's eyes. "He built a wall around his heart at 15. He didn't let anyone inside, didn't trust anyone, didn't love anyone. He turned himself into a monster because he believed monsters couldn't be hurt." "And that guilt?" Willa asked, remembering what Abraham had said to her about not saving someone. Pearl was silent for a long moment, as if weighing how much to give away. "Abraham carries more guilt than you know," she said at last. "Not just about Molly. He believes he's been responsible, indirectly, for the deaths of other innocent people. People who didn't deserve to die. People who, if he'd been more careful, more intelligent, more merciful, maybe wouldn't have died." Willa wanted to press for more, but something in Pearl's voice stopped her. A pain Pearl didn't want touched, a secret she wasn't ready to reveal. 22 years, Pearl continued, her voice softening. 22 years I've watched that boy live alone in a hell he built with his own hands. No one could get close. No one could reach him. Until you and that little girl came here." Willa blinked, not understanding. "Me? You and Poppy are the first people he's let inside that wall," Pearl said. "I've seen the way he looks at you, seen the way he sits and tells that child stories until she sleeps. Seen him keep Poppy's drawing like it's treasure. For 22 years, no one has been able to do that. But you did." Willa didn't know what to say. She sat there gripping her cup, feeling something shift inside her chest, an emotion she didn't dare name. Pearl studied her for a long moment, then added, her voice distant as if she were staring into an old memory. "You remind me of someone." "Who?" Willa asked. "A woman I met many years ago," Pearl said. "She protected her child the way you do. She was strong the way you are. She would have done anything to keep her child safe." Something strange moved through Pearl's voice, as if she weren't talking about a vague impression, but about someone specific, someone she knew well. "What happened to her?" Willa asked. Pearl didn't answer right away. Her eyes suddenly filled with an endless sadness, a deep grief Willa couldn't understand. "She's gone," Pearl said, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. 10 years ago, along with her little boy. Cold slid down Willa's spine. 10 years, a little boy. Just like her sister. Just like her nephew. But she couldn't connect the pieces. There was no reason Pearl would know Noelle. No reason Pearl's story would have anything to do with Willa's family. It was coincidence. It had to be. "I'm sorry," Willa said, not knowing what else to offer. Pearl shook her head and gave her that sad smile. "Don't be sorry. Just remember life is too short to live in fear. And sometimes the people who look like monsters are the ones who need love the most." Pearl stood, patted Willa's shoulder, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Willa alone with cold tea and 1,000 questions crowding her mind. She didn't know who Pearl had been talking about. She didn't know the strong woman Pearl remembered was her own sister, Noelle, the woman Pearl had met only once 10 years earlier, just before the fire took Noelle's life and Timothy's. Willa didn't know, and maybe that not knowing was the only thing keeping her heart from breaking apart. The 6th week marked a real change in Poppy. She was no longer the silent child with hollow eyes, clinging to her mother like she feared the world would swallow her whole. She began to talk. She began to laugh. She began to race through the estate as if it were her home. Pearl spoiled her endlessly, cooking the foods she liked, teaching her how to bake, telling her fairy tales before afternoon naps. Abraham still kept his distance, but every evening he sat in the library, waiting for the little girl to come draw beside him. And Willa, for the first time in 6 years, saw her daughter living like an ordinary child. But Poppy was 5, and 5-year-olds don't know how to tell friend from enemy. They trust anyone who's kind to them. Barrett was one of the guards stationed at the main gate of the estate. He was big, with a gentle face, always smiling whenever Poppy ran past. He'd started giving her candy in the 3rd week, colorful gummy bears that Poppy adored. She began calling him Mr. Barrett. She began stopping to chatter with him every time she passed the gate. She began to think of him as a friend in a house full of stern adults. Willa didn't suspect a thing. Neither did Abraham. Barrett had worked for the Callahan family for more than 5 years without a problem. No one knew that 6 months earlier, Mancini had gotten to him, threatened his family, promised him money big enough to disappear and start over somewhere else. Barrett didn't want to betray Abraham, but he had a wife. He had kids, people he loved more than loyalty to any boss, and Mancini knew exactly how to squeeze men like him. That afternoon, Poppy ran to the gate like she did every day, cheeks flushed from playing in the garden. Barrett was on duty, smiling when he saw her. "Mr. Barrett, Mr. Barrett," Poppy called, her voice bright. "Poppy has a secret." Barrett crouched down, pretending curiosity. "What secret is that, sweetheart?" Poppy glanced around like she was afraid someone might hear, then leaned close to his ear and whispered, "Mommy has a secret USB stick. Mommy hides it inside Poppy's teddy bear. Mommy said don't tell anyone, but Poppy tells Mr. Barrett, because Mr. Barrett is Poppy's friend." Barrett felt his heart speed up. The USB. The thing Derek Brennan was hunting like a madman. The thing Mancini had ordered found at any cost. And a 5-year-old had just told him exactly where it was. He forced his voice to stay normal, patted Poppy's head gently. "That's a very good secret, Mr. Barrett will keep it safe for Poppy, okay? Don't tell anyone else." Poppy beamed, nodded, and ran off to play again, unaware she'd just placed her mother's life in an enemy's hands. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Barrett slipped out of the estate. He walked 2 blocks to a bar where a black car was already waiting. He climbed into the back seat, and the man inside made his stomach turn cold. Derek Brennan, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, stubble unshaven, but the same sharp, ruthless stare as ever. "Talk," Derek ordered. "What have you got for me?" Barrett swallowed hard and started telling him. Everything. Where Willa was. Her room on the 2nd floor. The window facing the back garden. The routines of her and the child. The guard's patrol schedule. And most importantly, the USB hidden inside Poppy's teddy bear. Derek listened with a blank face, but his fist clenched hard on his thigh, betraying the agitation underneath. When Barrett finished, Derek nodded. "Good. You did good," Derek said, his voice ice cold. 3 days. "You open the back door for my men. Can you do that?" Barrett nodded without daring to meet Derek's eyes. He knew he was betraying Abraham. He knew he was putting a woman and a child in danger, but he didn't have a choice. At least, that's what he told himself. The black car vanished into the night. Barrett went back to the estate, climbed over the rear wall, and slipped back into position like nothing had happened. He didn't know someone was watching. A few hundred yards away, Detective Holloway sat in his car with binoculars trained on Abraham's estate. He'd been watching the place for 2 weeks, logging every person who came and went, every odd shift, every unusual movement. And tonight, he saw Barrett slip out at 2 a.m, saw him meet an unfamiliar car, saw him return as if he were hiding something. Holloway made a note in his pad, eyes narrowing in the dark. There was a mole inside the Callahan house, and if his instincts were right, Mancini was about to make a move. He needed to be ready, because when the storm hit, he wanted to be there to catch the big fish, both Callahan and Mancini. Upstairs in the second-floor bedroom, Willa slept deeply beside Poppy. She didn't know what her daughter had innocently done. She didn't know the enemy was drawing close. She didn't know the piece she thought she'd found was only a mirage, and the teddy bear lay in Poppy's arms, holding the USB like an innocent secret, unaware it was about to become the center of a coming storm. At 3 a.m, Abraham Callahan's estate lay in darkness and silence. The guards had just changed shifts, the fresh men settling into position still half asleep, their alertness not yet sharpened to its highest edge. It was the perfect window to strike. Derek Brennan didn't bring an army. He knew better than anyone that a full-scale assault would wake the whole area, give Abraham time to react, and turn everything into a war he wasn't certain he could win. No, Derek chose a different approach. Quiet, precise, lethal. Just him and his 3 most trusted men, the ones who'd been with him from the beginning, the ones willing to die for him, and Barrett, the mole waiting at the back door. They climbed over the wall at a blind spot in the cameras, the place Barrett had marked in advance. They moved through the dark like ghosts. Not a sound, not a mistake. Barrett opened the back door at the appointed time, his face pale in the moonlight, but he didn't step back. He'd gone too far to turn around. Derek crossed the threshold with his gun steady in his hand, eyes sweeping the pitch-black space. He didn't say a word to Barrett. No thanks, no reassurance. Traitors didn't deserve respect, no matter who they betrayed for. They went up the stairs, their footsteps soft as cats. Barrett led them, pointing out which room was Willa and Poppy's, which room was Abraham's, which room belonged to Pearl. Derek signaled for 2 men to hold the hallway, 1 to hold the stairs. He and the remaining man moved toward Willa's door. It wasn't locked. Willa had stopped locking it in the 3rd week, when she began to feel safe in this house, a mistake she was about to pay for. Derek pushed the door open, stepped inside, and took in the sight before him. Willa lay on the bed with her arm around Poppy, both of them sleeping deeply. Moonlight spilled through the window across their faces, peaceful and innocent. Derek stood there a moment, looking at his wife and daughter, and something passed through his eyes that no one could truly read. Pain, longing, possession, all of it twisted together into the warped emotion he called love. Willa jolted awake when she felt someone watching her. Survival instinct, honed by 6 years with Derek, snapped her into motion. Her eyes opened, and her heart stopped when she saw the familiar shape at the foot of her bed. Derek. He'd found her. Willa wanted to scream, but Derek was faster. He stepped close and pressed 1 finger to his lips, telling her to stay quiet. His other hand held a gun, not aimed at her, but close enough for her to understand the message. "Shh," Derek whispered, his voice strangely gentle. "Don't wake the little one. I don't want her scared." Willa swallowed, forcing herself to stay calm. She looked past Derek's shoulder and saw another man in the doorway, and behind him, a familiar face. Barrett, the guard who gave Poppy candy, the man her daughter trusted, the man Poppy had told about the USB. Everything snapped into focus, bright as day. Her daughter had betrayed her without meaning to. It wasn't Poppy's fault. She was 5. She didn't know what danger looked like, didn't know who deserved trust and who didn't. She only wanted to share a secret with someone she believed was a friend. But that innocence had led Derek here. It had placed mother and child in the hands of the man Willa had been running from for 6 weeks. Pain ripped through Willa from the inside. Not anger at her daughter. Guilt, because she hadn't protected her. Because she'd let Poppy trust the wrong person. Because she'd failed again. But this wasn't the moment to collapse. She swallowed the pain down, shoved it into the deepest corner of her mind, and focused on what mattered now. "What do you want?" Willa asked, her voice steadier than she expected. You're my wife, Derek said, as if it were the most obvious answer in the world. Poppy is my child. I came to take my family home. Home? Willa nearly laughed, bitter and sharp. The place you kept me locked up for 6 years? The place you hit me every time I displeased you? That's not home. That's hell. Derek's brow tightened, but he didn't explode the way she expected. Instead, he moved closer, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at Poppy sleeping. I know I was wrong, he said, voice low. I've changed. Only after you left did I realize I can't live without you and our daughter. I'll do anything for you to forgive me. Just come home. Willa wanted to laugh in his face, wanted to tell him she'd heard those words 100 times, every time after he'd beaten her, every time after she threatened to leave. But before she could speak, Poppy stirred and woke up. The child opened her eyes, saw Derek, and her face went through a storm of emotions no 5-year-old should ever have to carry. Fear, confusion, and, painfully, something like longing. Daddy, Poppy whispered, her voice barely more than breath. Derek smiled, the first smile Willa had seen on his face since he entered the room. He held out his arms, and Poppy, after a moment of hesitation, let him pull her in. Willa felt her heart fracture. Her daughter wasn't completely afraid of Derek. Her daughter still missed him, still had a part of her that ached for this man's love, no matter how much he'd hurt her mother. And that was the deepest tragedy of all. Willa could run from Derek, but she couldn't run from the truth that he was still her daughter's father, still a part of Poppy whether Willa wanted it or not. Come home with Daddy, sweetheart, Derek murmured into Poppy's ear. Daddy won't let anyone hurt you anymore. Willa watched the scene and knew she couldn't let it happen. She couldn't let Poppy go back to Derek. She couldn't let her daughter grow up in that house, see what Willa had seen, become the next victim of this man. She had to do something, but before she could move, gunshots exploded from downstairs, ripping through the quiet night. Abraham was awake. The gunshots from downstairs detonated chaos. Derek sprang to his feet at once, shoving Poppy back toward Willa, raising his weapon toward the door. He barked an order to the man holding the doorway, then stepped into the hallway himself, eyes sweeping the darkness. Willa pulled Poppy tight, shielding her daughter with her own body, her heart hammering so hard it felt like it might crack her ribs. She heard pounding footsteps, shouted voices, more shots snapping through the air, and then silence. A silence more frightening than the gunfire. Abraham Callahan appeared at the top of the stairs, smoke still curling from the barrel of the gun in his hand. He climbed one step at a time, slow and steady, eyes locked on Derek standing in the middle of the hallway. Behind Abraham, Brody was cuffing one of Derek's men, the only one left alive after the clash downstairs. The other two lay motionless. Derek, Abraham said, speaking his enemy's name, his voice ice cold. So you finally came. Derek turned, facing Abraham across the few yards of corridor. He didn't look afraid, even though he was clearly in the weaker position. Instead, he smiled, a thin smile, loaded with contempt and something that looked like cruel satisfaction. Callahan, Derek said, his voice echoing in the still air. Finally, face to face. You know, I've been waiting for this moment a long time. What moment? Abraham asked, his gun still leveled straight at Derek. The moment I get to tell you the truth, Derek replied, the smile widening. You thought you were some hero saving a damsel in distress. Thought you were protecting an innocent woman from an evil husband. He stepped aside, revealing Willa in the bedroom behind him, Poppy clutched in her arms. His gaze flicked over her, then snapped back to Abraham, wicked with intent. You know something, Callahan? You're the one who lit the fire that killed Noelle. I just gave you the address. Willa felt the world stop. Noelle, her sister's name, spoken from Derek's mouth. Her eyes jumped from Derek to Abraham, not understanding, not wanting to understand. Abraham didn't react. He didn't deny it. He didn't look surprised. He only stood there, face carved from stone, but in his gray eyes something was breaking. Yes, Abraham said, his voice low and heavy. I gave the order to burn that warehouse. I didn't know there were people inside. It felt like a fist drove straight into Willa's chest. No, it couldn't be. Abraham, the man who'd saved her, the man who'd protected her, the man who'd told her daughter stories at night. He was the one who killed her sister? Derek's laugh grew louder, ricocheting down the hallway like a crow's cry. Didn't know, he repeated, dripping with mockery. That's right. You didn't know, but I did. Noelle knew too much about me, about my work, about the people I'd killed. She threatened to go to the police. She had to die. Willa felt the blood in her body turn to ice. Derek knew. Derek knew there were people in that warehouse. Derek had let her sister die on purpose. Her and her little brat, Derek went on, his voice empty of regret. Shame the kid had to go too. But I couldn't leave a witness, not even a 3-year-old witness. Timothy, her nephew. The 3-year-old boy she'd once held in her arms, once sung to sleep, once promised to protect. Derek had killed him, on purpose, without hesitation. Willa didn't know what she'd done. She only knew that when her awareness snapped back into place, she was standing in the hallway with a gun in her hand. The weapon she must have ripped from Derek's man without even realizing it. Poppy was crying somewhere behind her, the sound reaching Willa as if from another world. She stood between two men. One was Derek, her husband, her child's father, the man who had deliberately killed her sister and nephew. The other was Abraham, the man who had saved her, protected her, but who had still been the one to strike the match, even if by accident. Both of them were tied to Noelle and Timothy's deaths. Both of them had her family's blood on their hands. Willa's hand shook. The gun felt heavy in her palm. She didn't know who to point it at. "Willa," Abraham said, his voice low and raw with pain. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. If I'd known." "He didn't know," Derek cut in, contempt sharp in his tone. "That's the difference between me and him, Willa. He kills people because he's stupid. I kill people because it's necessary. But the result's the same, isn't it? Your sister's dead. Your nephew's dead." Willa stared at Derek, into the eyes of the man she'd once believed she loved, the man she'd once hoped could change, the man she'd tried to forgive again and again. She saw nothing but coldness, cruelty, complete indifference to her pain. Then she looked at Abraham. He stood there, his gun lowered now, not trying to justify himself, not trying to plead. He only watched her with eyes full of guilt, full of hurt, full of acceptance, as if he was ready for whatever she chose. "Shoot me if you need to," Abraham said, his voice steady. "I deserve to die. I've known that for 10 years. And I don't," Derek cut in, his voice turning suddenly sweet, persuasive. "You know me, Willa. I do what has to be done to protect my family. Noelle was a threat. I had to remove her. But you and Poppy are different. You're my wife. Poppy's my child. I'd never hurt either of you." Willa felt sick. He was trying to talk her into it, trying to make the murder of her sister sound reasonable, forgivable, trying to turn her into an accomplice by reminding her of the family tie between them. She raised the gun, her hand still shaking, but her finger settling onto the trigger. She didn't know who she was going to shoot. She only knew someone in this room had to pay for Noelle and Timothy. The standoff between the three of them was shattered by a gunshot from the stairwell. Brody had spotted Barrett trying to slip out through the back door, and he didn't hesitate. One single shot. Barrett went down, the traitor paying with his life, but that shot was also the signal that let chaos burst wide open. Derek seized the split second of distraction, twisted, and fired at Abraham. The bullet grazed Abraham's left shoulder, blood spraying, but Abraham didn't fall. He answered with 2 shots in quick succession, forcing Derek to dive into the adjoining room for cover. Willa didn't stand there and wait. She didn't retreat into a corner the way she used to, the way she had for 6 years every time Derek's anger rose. She lunged for Poppy, pulled her off the bed, and crushed her daughter to her chest. "Mommy," Poppy sobbed, her eyes wide with terror. "What's happening?" "It's okay," Willa lied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll protect you. I promise." She scanned the room for a way out. The main door was a firefight. The window was too high to jump with a child in her arms. The only option left was the connecting door into the next room, where there was access to a back hallway. She ran for it, Poppy clinging hard around her neck, and at that exact moment Pearl appeared in the doorway. "Follow me," Pearl said, her voice strangely calm in the middle of the chaos. "There's a safe room under the basement. They won't find you down there." Willa nodded and followed Pearl through the back hall. Behind her, gunfire kept cracking. Abraham barking orders at his men, Brody shouting something, Derek cursing. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Not now. Not when Poppy needed her. They reached the top of the basement stairs when a figure stepped out of the shadows. One of Derek's men Brody had missed. blood running from his shoulder but a gun still in his hand. He saw Willa and Poppy, and his eyes lit up. "Stop," he ordered, raising his weapon. Pearl didn't hesitate. She threw herself at him, shoving Willa and Poppy behind her. He fired. Pearl dropped, one hand clutching her belly, blood spreading across the white fabric of her nightgown. Willa screamed. But she didn't stop. She lifted the gun she'd been holding all this time, and she fired. The bullet hit the man square in the chest. He fell and didn't move again. It was the first time in Willa's life she'd killed someone. She didn't have time to think about it. She dropped to her knees beside Pearl, trembling hands pressing down on the bleeding wound. "Pearl, Pearl," she cried. "Go," Pearl whispered, her eyes already going dim. "Take the little one down. Don't worry about me." Willa didn't want to leave her, but Poppy was crying, shaking, needing her. And Pearl was staring up at her with fierce determination, pushing her to go. "I'll come back," Willa said, not knowing whether it was a promise or a lie. "You wait for me." She scooped Poppy up and ran down the stairs into the dark basement, slamming the heavy steel door shut behind them. She sat in the darkness, holding her daughter tight, listening to the gunfire echo from above. On the ground floor, Abraham was facing Derek in the living room. Both men were wounded, both still had bullets, neither one willing to back down. Brody had finished off the remaining men, but he couldn't get to his brother because he was dealing with another problem. Gianna. She appeared at the back door, face bloodless, eyes wide with fear. She'd come to warn Brody about the attack after hearing something from inside Mancini, but she was too late, and now she was standing in the middle of a battlefield, exposed for everyone to see. Abraham saw her, saw the way Brody rushed to her, shielding her, keeping her behind him, saw the way she clutched Brody's hand like it was her only lifeline, and he understood the secret his brother had been hiding. The inside source in Mancini, Salvatore Mancini's niece. An impossible love. After this, Abraham said to Brody, his voice flat, "We're going to talk, if there even is an after." Red and blue lights flashed outside the windows, tearing through the night. Police sirens. Detective Holloway had arrived, bringing a tactical unit after hearing gunfire from his surveillance position. He'd surrounded the estate, blocked every exit. No one was getting out. Derek looked toward the windows, saw the police cars, and his face changed. He was trapped, between Abraham and the cops, between choices that all led to prison or death. "This isn't over, Callahan," Derek growled. "It's not over until I say it's over." He lunged for the stairs, for the basement, for Willa and Poppy. Abraham charged after him, ignoring the blood seeping from his shoulder. He couldn't let Derek reach the basement, couldn't let him touch Willa and Poppy again. Not after everything. Not after the promise he'd made to protect them. The two men crashed into each other at the head of the stairs, rolling down step after step in a tangle of fists, snarled breaths, and hatred piled up over years. Their guns flew out of their hands, and when they finally stopped at the bottom, both of them were injured, both of them gasping, and neither one of them willing to quit. Willa heard the chaos above, and knew she couldn't stay hidden in the bunker forever. She set Poppy down, knelt in front of her daughter, and held the little girl's shoulders firmly in both hands. "You stay here," Willa said, her voice strict but threaded with love. "You don't go outside. No matter what you hear, you don't open the door. You only open it when Mommy calls your name. Do you understand?" Poppy nodded, blue eyes swimming with tears. "You'll come back, right?" "I promise," Willa said. "I always come back for you." She kissed her daughter's forehead, quickly ripped the hidden drive from the seams of Poppy's teddy bear, and shoved it into her pocket, then stood, gripped the gun tight in her hand, and stepped out of the bunker. She climbed the stairs one step at a time, her heart pounding wildly, but her hands weren't shaking anymore. She'd shaken enough. She'd been afraid enough. She'd run enough. Tonight, she wasn't running. She found them at the bottom of the main staircase, both men on the floor, both wounded and gasping for air. Derek was trying to push himself upright, blood streaming from a cut on his head where he'd hit the steps. Abraham lay a few yards away, his left shoulder soaked red, but his gray eyes were still open, still tracking every move his enemy made. When Willa appeared with the gun in her hand, both men froze. "Willa," Derek spoke first, his voice aching and pleading at once. "Listen to me. I know I was wrong. I know I've done things that can't be forgiven. But I love you. I've loved you since the first day I met you. No one loves you the way I do." Willa stared at him. The man she'd once called her husband. The man she'd once believed she'd spend her life with. She looked into eyes trying to perform sincerity, into a face that had once made her believe, once made her hope, once made her fall apart again and again. "You don't know what love is, Derek," she said, her voice colder than she expected. "You only know how to possess, to control, to destroy. That isn't love." Derek opened his mouth to keep talking, but Willa had already turned to Abraham. He stayed where he was, not trying to rise, not trying to fight for her attention. He only looked at her with guilt and acceptance. "Shoot me if you want," Abraham said, his voice low and exhausted. "I deserve to die. I've deserved it since 10 years ago, when I lit that fire without checking if anyone was inside. I don't deserve forgiveness." He paused, swallowed, then forced the words out anyway. "But if you've got even a little mercy left, don't go back to him. Even if you shoot me, even if you hand me to the police, even if you choose anything at all, please don't go back to him. For Poppy. For Poppy." He repeated her daughter's name as if it was the most sacred thing in the world. "She deserves to live without fear. She deserves a mother who's free. She deserves a future. Don't let him take that away." Willa stood between the two men, the gun heavy in her hand. One had deliberately killed her sister. One had accidentally set the fire. One was begging with hollow promises. One was accepting death without pleading for his life. She knew what she had to do. She raised the gun and aimed straight at Derek. "Willa!" Derek shouted, his eyes going wide with terror. "You can't do this. You'll live with it for the rest of your life. You'll become a murderer." She squeezed the trigger. The shot thundered through the space. Derek screamed, both hands flying to his right knee, shattered apart, blood spurting and staining the floor. He writhed and howled, his pain tearing the night open, but he was still alive. Willa lowered the gun and looked at the man twisting on the ground in front of her, with eyes that held not a single drop of pity. "I'm not killing you because of Poppy," she said, her voice strangely calm. "She's lost enough already. She doesn't need the added weight of knowing her mother killed her father." She stepped closer, standing over Derek as he groaned and shook. "But more than that, she needs to know her father's still alive, even if it's in prison, even if she never sees him again for the rest of her life. She needs to know he didn't die, that she doesn't carry the blood of a man who was killed by his own child's mother. That's the only thing I can give her." The front door burst open. Detective Holloway came in with a tactical team behind him, guns raised, flashlights sweeping the room. He took in the scene in one hard look. Derek on the floor clutching his bloody knee, Abraham a few yards away with his shoulder wound, and Willa standing between them with the gun lowered in her hand. "Mrs. Brennan," Holloway said, calm but wary. "Put the gun down." Slowly, Willa did. She set the gun on the floor, nudged it away with her foot, then straightened. She met Holloway's gaze, pulled the USB she'd kept hidden for so long from her pocket, and held it out. "This is what you need," she said, placing it in his hand. "Evidence to put Derek Brennan in prison. And more than that," Holloway looked at the USB, then at her, and something like respect flickered in his seasoned eyes. He nodded, tucked the USB into his jacket, then signaled his team to move in and cuff Derek. Derek was still screaming, cursing, threatening, but no one listened. No one cared. He was just a defeated man now, a criminal about to face justice. Along with Derek, Vince was also taken into custody, finally forced to answer for the decade of lies he had fed to the Callahan family. Willa watched them drag him away and felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, no pain, only emptiness, a vast hollow where 6 years of hell had once lived. She turned and looked at Abraham. Medics had come to wrap his wound, but his eyes stayed on her, full of guilt, full of gratitude, full of something she wouldn't name. She didn't speak. She only turned away and went back down to the basement, to where Poppy was waiting. Her daughter needed her. And right then, that was the only thing that mattered. 6 months after that night of terror, Derek Brennan stood in federal court facing a sentence of 40 years in prison. The USB Willa handed to Detective Holloway held more than enough evidence to bury him for good. 12 murders, dozens of illegal transactions, and most important of all, proof that he had deliberately ordered the warehouse burned with full knowledge that people were inside. Derek didn't look at Willa when the sentence was read. He stared straight ahead, his face set like stone, as if refusing to accept the reality in front of him. But when the officers snapped the cuffs on his wrists and began to lead him away, he turned one last time and looked at Poppy sitting beside her mother in the back row. The little girl didn't wave. She didn't cry. She only looked at her father with clear blue eyes, and no one could read what she was feeling behind them. It was the last time Poppy ever saw Derek. Pearl didn't make it. She died on the operating table 3 days after the night of chaos. The wound too severe, the blood loss too great, her age too high. Abraham sat by her hospital bed through her final hours, gripping the wrinkled hand that was slowly turning cold. Before she closed her eyes for the last time, Pearl told him what she had kept hidden for 22 years. "Your mother," Pearl whispered, her voice as weak as a breath of wind. "She was the one who opened the door for the enemy that night. She betrayed your father for money, for what Mancini promised her." Abraham didn't speak. He only sat there as Pearl let out her final breath, and felt another piece of himself die with her. His mother, the woman who gave birth to him, who left him with his father after the divorce, who had remained in their lives as a distant, hollow ghost, until vanishing completely the very night of the massacre when he was 15. She had been the root of it all. His father's death. Molly's death. 22 years he had lived in the hell of guilt, and the source of it was the one person who should have loved him most. A week after Pearl's funeral, Brody came to Abraham in his study. He didn't come alone. Gianna stood beside him, her hand locked tight around Brody's, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to face Abraham. "I'm leaving," Brody said, his voice steady but full of pain. "Gianna and I are getting out of Chicago. Out of everything. I don't know when I'll be back. Maybe never." Abraham looked at his brother, looked at the woman who had made his brother betray the family. He wanted to be angry, wanted to shout at Brody's face, wanted to say he'd chosen the enemy over blood, but he didn't. He'd already lost too much. He couldn't lose his brother too, not even inside his own hatred. "Go," Abraham said, his voice worn out. "Live the life you want. Don't look back." Brody hugged his brother, for the first time in years, then turned and walked out the door. He didn't turn around, and Abraham stood alone in the empty estate, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. He'd lost everything: Pearl, Brody, the truth about his mother, his faith in himself. Only Willa and Poppy remained, 2 people he didn't deserve and couldn't let go of. Willa didn't forgive Abraham. She told him that plainly one night when Poppy was asleep and the house had fallen quiet. "I can't forgive you," she said, her voice not angry, only brutally true. "Maybe I won't be able to for the rest of my life. My sister died. My nephew died. Even if you didn't mean it, even if Derek was the one behind it, you were still the one who struck the match. I can't look at you and not think of that." Abraham nodded and accepted it. He didn't beg. He didn't justify himself. He only asked one question. "Then why are you still here?" Willa was quiet for a long moment. Then she glanced toward the stairs, toward where Poppy's bedroom waited on the 2nd floor. "Because of Poppy," she said. "She's lost too much. She needs stability. She needs a home. She needs familiar faces. And even if I hate admitting it, she needs you. You're the first person besides me that she's trusted. I can't take that from her." She paused, then pulled an old photograph from her pocket. A picture of Noelle and Timothy, taken a few months before they died. Noelle was smiling, one arm around her 3-year-old son with blonde hair and blue eyes, his grin bright as sunlight. "This is my sister," Willa said, setting the photo on the desk in front of Abraham. "And this is my nephew, Timothy. He liked strawberry ice cream, just like Molly. He was afraid of the dark, just like Molly. He was 3 when he died." Abraham stared at the photograph, at the faces of the people he had indirectly killed, and felt his heart break all over again. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "There aren't words that are enough." "There aren't," Willa agreed. "But there is one way you can pay your debt. Not to me. To them. To Noelle. To Timothy. To every innocent person who died because of a meaningless war between men like you." "How?" Abraham asked, his voice rough. "Live like you mean something," Willa said. "Stop killing people. Stop doing what you know is wrong. Find another way to survive in this world without adding more blood to your hands. That's the price. That's the only way you can ever pay this back." Abraham looked at her, into green eyes, demanding he change everything he had been for 22 years. He didn't know if he could do it. He didn't know if he was strong enough to step out of the darkness that had fed him for so long. But he knew he would try. For Noelle and Timothy. For Pearl and Molly. For Willa and Poppy. For himself. The man he had been before this world turned him into a monster. "I'll try," he said. "I can't promise anything, but I'll try." Willa nodded, stood, and walked toward the door. Before she left, she paused without turning back. "Tomorrow is Poppy's birthday," she said. "She wants you there." She hesitated, then added, her voice lighter, softer. "So do I." Then she walked out, leaving Abraham alone in the study, the photograph of Noelle and Timothy still in his hands. The room dark. No kiss, no forgiveness, no promises about the future, only a door left slightly open. And sometimes that's all a person needs. A chance, a hope, a reason to wake up tomorrow and try to be better than they were yesterday. Abraham Callahan, a Mafia boss with blood on his hands, had found that reason. In the blue eyes of a 5-year-old who called him a friend, in the gaze of a woman who wouldn't forgive him, but still gave him a chance. In the memory of the dead, the ones he owed a life worth living. This story is a reminder that in life, no one is perfect, and no one walks without carrying their own sins and mistakes. What matters isn't only what we did in the past, but what we choose to do from this moment forward. Forgiveness doesn't always come right away, and sometimes it never comes at all. But hope can still take root, even in the hearts that seem the most hardened. Sometimes the greatest debts can't be paid with money or blood. They can only be paid by living each day in a way that honors someone else's sacrifice, by loving the people who are still here, by giving what we once never received. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so we can spread meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of anything in real life? Have you ever had to face a choice between forgiveness and hatred? We'd truly love to hear what's in your heart in the comments below. Every word you share is a powerful encouragement that helps us keep bringing you better stories. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the very end. We wish you and your family good health, joyful days, peaceful hearts, and a life filled with quiet happiness. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.